An elderly farmer stumbled upon 3 abandoned infants on his land, and as he got closer, he froze, noticing something unusual. The first light of dawn was beginning to creep over the mountains surrounding the small homestead where 70-year-old John Parker had spent his entire life. His face, weathered by deep lines and a faint, weary smile, bore the marks of wisdom and the sacrifices of a life dedicated to farming. That morning started like so many others. John stepped out early, accompanied by Daisy, his loyal mutt with bright, watchful eyes who never left his side. The fields were still cloaked in a misty veil when John noticed something strange. Daisy, typically calm, began barking and behaving restlessly, directing his attention toward a small grove at the edge of his land. "What is it, Daisy?" he asked in his raspy voice, following the dog's lead. As they entered the grove, the air grew colder. Daisy dashed ahead, stopping abruptly near some bushes. Then, a faint cry pierced the stillness of the morning. John's heart raced as he approached, carefully parting the branches. To his astonishment, he found 3 infants bundled in tattered blankets, nestled in a makeshift bed of dry leaves. "Dear God," he muttered, leaning in to check if the tiny ones were breathing. There were 2 girls and 1 boy, their frail faces flushed red from the cold, their tiny bodies trembling. Overwhelmed, John scanned the area for any sign of who might have left them there. "Who could do such a thing?" he whispered, his voice shaky as his hands trembled against his weathered face. Daisy looked at him, her eyes urging him to act. John drew a deep breath, gently wrapping the babies in his worn wool coat before lifting them carefully. As he made his way back home, his mind swirled with unanswered questions. When he reached the house, his wife, Mary Parker, met him at the door. Her hair was tucked neatly under a kerchief, and her flour-covered hands paused mid-motion. "John, what's wrong? You're as pale as a ghost," she asked, alarmed, before noticing the bundle in his arms. "Mary, you won't believe what I found," he said, stepping inside and laying the infants on the wooden table. Mary dropped the bowl she was holding, covering her mouth in shock. "Oh Lord above, where did these babies come from?" she exclaimed, moving closer for a better look. "They were left in the grove. Daisy found them," John said, his voice still tinged with disbelief. Mary sprang into action. She grabbed clean blankets and used the little milk they had for breakfast, trying to feed the babies with a spoon. John lit the stove to warm the house. "Mary, what are we going to do?" This is more than we can handle," he said, sitting down, his hands clasped tightly. "First, we'll care for them. We can't just leave them like this. Then we'll figure out the rest," Mary replied with a firm resolve that reflected her inner strength. The day passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional cries of the infants. Mary and John took turns holding them, doing their best to soothe and warm the little ones. At one point, as Mary rocked one of the girls in her arms, she glanced at John with a serious expression. "What if these children are from our village? Why would someone leave them there?" she asked quietly. "Mary, I have no idea. I'd like to think no one from here could do something like this," John replied, stroking Daisy, who lay near the stove, her eyes never leaving the babies. That night, their usually quiet home was filled with the soft cries of the little ones. John, accustomed to the stillness of rural life, couldn't ignore each whimper and sob that echoed through the small house. He stood up several times to assist Mary, though his clumsy movements revealed how unfamiliar he was with taking care of children. "Tomorrow, we need to talk to someone, maybe the police or even Father James at the church. We can't handle this alone," Mary said as she tucked the children into the bed, carefully placing a blanket rolled into a cozy nest around them. John nodded silently, gazing out the window into the darkness of the night. Something deep inside him whispered that this encounter would change their lives forever. By dawn, neither John nor Mary had gotten much rest. Between the children's cries and their own anxieties, sleep had eluded them. The usually serene rhythm of their rural home was replaced by new sounds and unanticipated challenges. As usual, John rose early and headed out to the yard to feed the animals. Vera, their dog, followed him closely, sensing the unease hanging in the air. Meanwhile, Mary was in the kitchen, preparing a broth to regain strength after the restless night. The babies had finally fallen asleep, swaddled in a makeshift quilt Mary had crafted from old fabric scraps. "John, come here for a moment," Mary called from the doorway. "What's wrong?" he replied, setting down the bucket of chicken feed and heading inside. She stood there, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "We can't just leave them, John. It's not that I don't want to help, but we're old. We barely have enough for ourselves. This is too much." John removed his hat and clenched it in his hands, his gaze fixed on the floor. He knew she was right, but something inside him refused to even consider abandoning those children. "I know, Mary, but where would we leave them? What would happen to them?" he asked, his voice trembling. Mary let out a heavy sigh, grappling with the weight of their dilemma. She too felt a strong bond with the children, but reality loomed over them. Barely scraping by on their modest farm was hard enough. At that moment, one of the babies began to cry, interrupting their conversation. Mary quickly picked the child up, soothing them as John watched silently until the crying stopped. "Listen, John, we won't solve anything until we speak with Father James. He's wise and respected. Maybe he'll guide us on what to do," she suggested, gently rocking the baby. "All right, we'll talk to him after breakfast. But know this. If we can't find a proper solution, I won't let these children suffer. I'll do whatever it takes," John said firmly, his voice filled with resolve. Mary was momentarily surprised but deeply moved. She knew her husband was a man of principle, always guided by his conscience, even when circumstances were stacked against him. Later that morning, they bundled the babies in warm blankets and placed them in an old wooden cart they typically used for hauling crops. The path to the village church was long, and the cart creaked over the uneven ground. They spoke little during the journey, each lost in their thoughts, trying to imagine what Father James might say. When they reached the stone church, standing steadfast for centuries, Father James came out to meet them. A man with salt and pepper hair and a calm demeanor, he greeted them warmly. "John, Mary, what brings you here so early?" he asked with a kind smile that quickly faded as he noticed the bundles in the cart. "Father, we need your help. We've found, well, 3 little ones, and we don't know what to do," John said, gesturing toward the babies. Father James froze for a moment, examining the infants with a mix of astonishment and concern. "Oh, dear God. Come inside, quickly. This isn't something to discuss out here," he said, motioning them into the church. Once inside the cozy but modest vestry, John and Mary hesitated to sit. The worn wooden benches felt uninviting, and they shuffled awkwardly before settling down. "Well, start from the beginning and tell me everything. I can hardly believe my eyes," he said, settling down across from them and folding his hands on the table. John Parker cleared his throat, as though gathering his thoughts, and began his story. "Father, this is strange. Something like this has never happened to us before. This morning, I went out as usual with Vera, our dog. At first, it was all routine, but then she started acting restless, barking, growling, pulling toward the grove. I followed her, and suddenly, I heard crying. Faint, like the mewling of a kitten. I got closer, parted the bushes, and there they were, 3 of them. 3 babies wrapped in tattered cloth, lying on dry leaves." Father James frowned, his expression growing heavier. 3 children? Alone?" he asked, as if unable to believe what he'd just heard. "Yes, Father. 3, a boy and 2 girls. They're so tiny, so frail. Their cheeks were red from the cold." John Parker glanced down at his calloused hands, roughened by years of hard work. "At first, I didn't dare pick them up. I was afraid something might be wrong. But then," he sighed, "I couldn't leave them there. I wrapped them in my coat and brought them home." "And I," Mary Alexievna added. "The moment I saw John at the door, I knew something was wrong. He's always so steady, but his face? He was pale, like the cold had gotten to him. At first, I thought maybe someone in the village had died. But then I noticed he was holding something. I stepped closer, and there they were." She stopped, covering her mouth with her hand, tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh Lord, they were so tiny. I immediately grabbed some milk and whatever I could to warm them up and feed them." Father James sat quietly, his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the worn wooden floor. "And what happened next?" he asked softly. "What could we do?" John Parker shook his head. "The children warmed up, but we don't know what to do next. They're not ours to keep, and we're not young anymore. We'd hoped for a quiet old age, but now—" "Don't say that, Vanya," Mary Alexievna interrupted firmly. "They're ours now, even if they're not ours by blood. How could we leave them, Father? We're not heartless." "You're right," Father James nodded. "But I can see this is hard on you." John Parker sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Father, it is hard, I won't deny it. But how can I abandon them? They're all alone. No one's going to come looking for them, are they?" "Don't be so sure," the priest replied thoughtfully. "They might have family who don't know what happened. We should try to find out where they came from. Are you certain there were no clues in the grove? No notes, no belongings? Nothing, father, just old rags, John replied, frowning. It's cold and gloomy there, someone must have just left them. Like trash? Mary Alexievna scolded him gently. Don't say that, maybe the person was desperate, we don't know their story. Father James listened carefully, then stood and placed a reassuring hand on John Parker's shoulder. Here's what I think. You followed your heart and did the right thing. This won't be an easy road, but perhaps it's your calling to give these children a home. I'll help you. Let me ask around and see if anyone knows about their family. If we find no one, we'll figure out the next steps together. We're barely getting by as it is, John admitted, his voice heavy with worry. Now, 3 more mouths to feed. I understand your situation, Father James said gently. But God sees your hearts, and I believe things will work out as they should. Mary Alexievna clasped her hands tightly to her chest, as if shielding her emotions, while John Parker stared down, wrestling with his feelings. At that moment, they both realized their lives would never be the same. What should we do now? Mary quietly asked, holding the babies close to her chest. Pray and do your best, replied the priest, resting a hand on John's shoulder. I'll help you however I can. John and Mary left the church with heavy hearts, yet carrying a glimmer of hope. They hardly spoke on their way home. The babies slept soundly in the cart, blissfully unaware of the upheaval their arrival had brought to this family's world. By the time they returned, the sun stood high in the sky. Their small farm, with its leaning fence and humble house, seemed even more modest compared to the weight of their new responsibilities. Mary wasted no time, spreading blankets on the floor to create a cozier spot for the children to sleep. You're right, John. We need to get this house in order, she said. We can't keep babies on the kitchen table. I'll check the shed. There are some old boards out there. Maybe I can piece together a crib, John replied, grabbing his hat and heading outside. While John worked in the shed, Mary tended to the babies. Her long-dormant maternal instincts awakened as she cared for them. Memories of her own children as infants came flooding back. How could anyone just leave them like this? She murmured, gently stroking one baby's head. Their dog, Vera, lying faithfully by the stove, gazed at her intently. A few hours later, John returned with a small wooden structure he had cobbled together. It wasn't perfect, but it was sturdy and safe. Not much of a crib, but it'll do, he muttered, placing it in the corner of the room. Thank you, John. Now, help me warm up some milk. The babies haven't eaten yet, Mary said, motioning toward the small kettle by the stove. The rest of the day was consumed by caring for the infants. Every little task, from feeding to changing blankets, felt like a challenge. Their hands, accustomed to rough farm work, now had to perform delicate, careful movements. How do young parents manage all this? John grumbled as he awkwardly held one of the babies. With less complaining, John, Mary teased, her smile attempting to lighten the mood. But beneath their rare smiles and humor, the harsh reality of their situation loomed large. Mary began calculating how long their food supplies might last and realized it wouldn't be enough. By evening, as the house fell silent, Mary and John sat wearily by the stove, determined but exhausted. I don't know what's ahead, John, Mary admitted, staring into the flames. But I feel like these children were brought to us for a reason. You might be right, John sighed. But this is no small burden. They lapsed into silence, each lost in thought. Mary eventually rose to check on the children. Standing by the makeshift crib, she paused, gazing at their peaceful faces. Whatever happens, they're safe. That's what matters, she whispered. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Mary was already bustling about, preparing a modest breakfast. John headed outside to tend to the animals, but his mind was set on a plan. I'm going to visit Henry, he told Mary, adjusting his worn hat and grabbing his walking stick. If anyone knows what's been going on around here, it's him. Will you manage on your own? Go ahead, John. I'll stay here with the babies. But don't take too long, Mary replied, holding one of the girls in her arms. As usual, their loyal dog followed John. The path to Henry's house was long and uneven, winding through overgrown bushes and dusty trails. As John Parker walked along the path, his mind kept circling back to the children. Who was their mother? What could have driven her to abandon 3 babies in such a desolate place? The more he pondered, the fewer answers he found. By the time he reached Henry's house, the old man was already sitting on the porch, as if anticipating his arrival. Good morning, Parker. You're up early. What brings you here? Henry asked, his deep voice resonating like an echo from bygone days. "Henry, something strange has happened. I came seeking your advice," John replied, settling on the worn bench beside him. He began recounting the events. Henry listened intently, his expression growing darker as the story unfolded. "This is unusual, Parker," he said after a long pause. "I've heard of a woman who used to live near your land, in the woods. Her name was Charlotte. They say she was young but terribly lonely, with a family she couldn't turn to. Some even whispered she was expecting a child. Those children might be hers." "Charlotte," John repeated, trying to recall anything about her. "I didn't know her well," Henry admitted. "But if they're her children, why did she leave them? And what happened to her?" "No one really knows. She avoided people and seemed to have nowhere to turn," Henry sighed. "But be cautious, Parker. People love to gossip and might not understand why the children are with you now." Henry's words lingered in John's mind as he made his way home. When he got back, he shared what he'd learned with Mary. She listened quietly, continuing to feed the infants. "Charlotte, I've never heard of her. But if she lived so secluded, that's not surprising," Mary remarked. "Perhaps Father James knows more. He's always aware of what's happening around here." "Maybe," John agreed, though his brow furrowed. "What Henry said troubles me. People talk, and it's rarely kind. We should be ready for that." Mary said nothing, but her expression darkened. She understood how quickly rumors spread in their small village and how harshly people judged. That evening, Mary decided to visit their elderly neighbor, Eleanor Baker, a woman known for her sharp memory. If anyone knew about Charlotte, it would be her. "Good evening, Eleanor Baker," Mary greeted her by the gate. "May I ask you something?" "Mary, is something wrong?" the older woman asked, surprised. "Do you remember a woman named Charlotte? They say she lived alone in the woods." At the mention of the name, Eleanor's face changed. "Charlotte? Yes, I remember her. Poor girl. Her family rejected her because she wasn't, how do I put it, their idea of proper. She left and settled in an old cabin near the forest. Occasionally, she'd come to the village to sell herbs. She was quiet, but you could tell her life hadn't been easy." "What happened to her?" Mary asked cautiously. "No one knows for sure. They say she was expecting a child, but after that, she disappeared. Life might have been too much for her," Eleanor replied, shaking her head sadly. Mary returned home with a heavy heart and shared what she'd learned with John over dinner. "That explains a lot," John said after a long silence. "If Charlotte was their mother, they truly have no one left now." Mary looked at the children sleeping in the makeshift cradle. "John, whatever her story, we have to care for them. We don't have much, but we can't abandon them," she said firmly. "I know, Mary, I know," John replied softly, his gaze lingering on the small faces barely visible in the dim lamplight. The next morning, John and Mary decided to visit Father James again. Their situation was growing more complicated, and they needed answers. Hitching up their old horse, John laid the 3 infants on a padded blanket in the wagon. Mary climbed in beside them, and together they set off toward the village. The road was dusty, the wagon creaked with every bump, and Vera, their loyal dog, ran alongside, never straying far from the family. Both John and Mary were silent, lost in thought. When they finally arrived at the church, Father James was already waiting for them at the entrance. "Good morning, John, Mary," he greeted them warmly. "Come in. I think I have some information for you." They followed him into a small room attached to the church. The infants slept peacefully in a basket Mary had brought. "I've looked into Charlotte's story," Father James began, seating himself across from them. "She came to this area a few years ago, hoping for a fresh start away from those who had turned their backs on her. Her family rejected her because she became pregnant out of wedlock. Charlotte was proud and refused to ask for help, even when times were tough. She lived alone in an old cabin by the forest." Mary clutched her hands to her chest as John frowned. "What happened to her? Why would she leave the children?" John asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Father James lowered his gaze, as though gathering his thoughts. "Charlotte passed away shortly after giving birth. Some say it was from exhaustion and weakness. Before she died, she left a letter with an elderly woman who lived nearby. This woman handed it to me when I started asking questions. I believe you should read it." The priest reached into his worn leather bag and pulled out a yellowed envelope, handing it to Mary. Her hands trembled as she took it, carefully opened it, and began to read aloud. "To whoever finds my children. If you're reading this letter, it means I am no longer here. My children were my everything. but I could not give them the life they deserved. Please, take care of them. Their names are Sophia, Matthew, and Emil. They are my little miracles, and they deserve love and happiness. All I ask is that they know they were loved, even if I can't be there with them." Mary's voice faltered, tears welling in her eyes. John stared at the floor, his lips pressed into a hard line. "So it's true," he whispered. "These children, they're Charlotte's legacy. She loved them but couldn't carry the burden." Father James nodded solemnly. "I know this is difficult, John. But those children didn't end up with you by chance. Perhaps it's your calling to give them a home and a family." John sighed heavily, glancing at Mary. He saw the same mixture of grief and determination reflected in her eyes. "We can't leave them to fend for themselves, Mary. We promised ourselves we wouldn't let these children suffer. If Charlotte entrusted them to us, then it's our responsibility to care for them," John said firmly. Mary wiped her tears and nodded. "You're right, John. We can't abandon them. We don't have much, but we have enough where it counts. Love." Father James smiled warmly. "I'll help however I can. If you need food or anything else, come to the church. And remember, you're not alone. Go now, with peace." The walk home was quiet, but their hearts were filled with resolve. Once they returned, Mary tucked the children into their new beds, while John sat on the porch, gazing into the distance. Vera, their old dog, rested her head on her paws beside him. "You know, old girl," John said softly, stroking her fur. "Sometimes life throws challenges at you when you least expect them. But maybe that's what gives life meaning." Vera sighed as if in agreement. That evening, as John and Mary sat by the fire, the children slept peacefully in their corner. "We'll make it through this, won't we?" Mary asked quietly, her smile faint but hopeful. "We will, Mary. We're in this together," John replied, squeezing her hand. That night, like many to come, was a reminder that even in the hardest times, love and kindness can create miracles. Weeks passed since John and Mary discovered the truth about Charlotte and her children. Life on their small farm transformed completely. Their days revolved around the children, who were growing stronger and smiling more often. Though they were often exhausted and time was scarce, their home was filled with a newfound happiness. But challenges arose quickly. The food supplies dwindled as winter crept closer. One evening, as Mary prepared a modest meal with the last of their vegetables, she sighed and sat beside John. "John, we're almost out of milk. The kids are growing, and they need more food," she said softly. John ran a hand over his face, understanding the urgency. "Tomorrow, I'll go into town. I'll bring some grain and a sack of beans, maybe trade for milk and other essentials," he replied with determination. Mary nodded, though worry lingered in her eyes. She knew John disliked asking for help, always relying on his own labor. But now, pride was a luxury they couldn't afford. The next morning, John kept his promise. He hitched their old horse to the cart, loaded it with grain and beans, and set off down the dusty road. Vera trotted alongside him, sensing the importance of his mission. The town bustled with its usual activity. People went about their business, but many paused to watch John pass. Rumors of the 3 children he and Mary had taken in had spread quickly. Some admired their compassion, while others whispered behind their backs, doubting their motives. "Good day, John," called Dimitri, an old acquaintance and a seller of milk and oats. "Hello, Dimitri. I need milk and some oats for the children," John said, placing the sack of beans on the ground. "Children?" Dimitri raised an eyebrow. "Everyone's been talking about how you and Mary took in those little ones. Is it true?" "It's true," John said shortly, lowering his gaze. "We found them in the woods. We couldn't leave them behind." Dimitri's expression softened. "That's a noble thing you've done, John. Not everyone would have the heart for it." He gestured toward the milk and oats. "Take what you need. Don't worry about the beans, consider it my gift. Let those children grow up strong." John stood still for a moment, overwhelmed by an unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Daniel. You have no idea how much this means to us," he said sincerely. When John returned home, Mary was waiting anxiously at the door. Her face reflected both worry and relief. "How did it go, John?" she asked, helping him unload the cart. "It went well. Daniel gave us some milk and oats. It seems not everyone in the village is against us," John replied, handing her a large jug of milk. Mary smiled softly and carefully placed the jug on the table. "People will come around, John. The important thing is that we're doing our best." As the days passed, the little ones grew, and so did John and Mary's love for them. John, who had always been reserved and sparing with his words, found himself laughing and playing with the children on the floor. Mary, her heart rekindled with motherly tenderness, sang lullabies to them each evening. One night, as they sat by the fire after a long day, John broke the silence. "Mary, have you ever thought about how our lives might have been if we hadn't found these children?" Mary paused, her gaze softening. "The house would have stayed as empty and cold as it was before," she said quietly. "These children are a gift, John. Yes, it's not easy, but they've given us something we never dared to dream of." "Joy and hope," John agreed, staring into the fire. "You're right, Mary. We'll make it work. For them." That evening, as Mary tucked the children into their makeshift cribs, she watched their peaceful faces and whispered, "You're not alone. We'll always be here for you." Winter had fully settled in, blanketing the land in white. John and Mary's small homestead, tucked away at the edge of the village, felt even more secluded. The crackling of the fire became a comforting backdrop, and the warmth in their home wasn't just physical, it was heartfelt. Sophia, Matthew, and Emma grew quickly. Their laughter and playful chatter filled every corner of the house, turning it into a true home. One frosty morning, John stepped outside to fetch firewood. His eyes caught sight of snow-covered footprints leading from the gate to their porch. Vera, their old dog, let out a cautious growl. "What is it, girl?" John muttered, patting her head. He opened the gate and found a small bundle on the doorstep, a basket with some food and a folded note. Unfolding the paper, John read, "For the children. May they grow strong. Not everyone is against you." John stood there, staring at the note, then picked up the basket and brought it inside. "Mary, look, someone from the village left this for us," he said, placing the basket on the table. Mary held Emma in her arms as she glanced at the contents: flour, sugar, and a few apples. "Could someone have really helped us?" she whispered, her eyes wide with surprise. "Not everyone condemns us, Mary. Some understand," John replied, his voice filled with gratitude. From that day, neighbors began visiting more often. Some brought milk, others warm blankets or vegetables. Even those who once whispered behind their backs now looked at the elderly couple with newfound respect for taking on such a difficult responsibility. One sunny day, when the snow had started to melt, Father James arrived at their homestead. Riding his horse through the snowy fields, his figure stood out against the white landscape. "Good day, John and Mary," he greeted warmly, dismounting and approaching the porch. "Come in, Father James. Warm yourself," Mary invited, brushing flour from her hands. Father James stepped into the house, sitting down wearily by the fire to warm his hands. "I have news," he began, his tone serious. "I've been searching for Charlotte's family. Distant relatives have come forward, and they've expressed interest in meeting the children." A heavy silence fell over the room. Mary froze in place, and John slowly set his mug down on the table. "What did you say, Father? Do they want to take the children?" Mary finally asked, her voice trembling. "They wish to meet them," Father James clarified. "But the decision is yours. You've become their parents, and no one has the right to take them away without your consent." Mary sat down beside John, their eyes locking. In their gazes were fear, pain, and determination. "Father," John began, his voice hoarse, "we won't deny the children their family if they truly want to care for them. But we won't give them up easily. We need to be sure they'll be loved." "That's fair, John. I'll arrange a meeting. But remember, you've already done more for these children than anyone else ever has," Father James assured them before leaving. The next few days were filled with unease for John and Mary. The thought of losing Sophia, Matthew, and Emma was unbearable. John spent sleepless nights by the fire, staring into the flames, while Mary prayed quietly as she tucked the children in. "John, if these people truly love the children, wouldn't that be better for them?" Mary asked one evening, sitting beside him. "Maybe, Mary. But I'm not sure. We need to see for ourselves," he replied firmly. On the appointed day, John and Mary stood at their doorstep, holding hands. A cart pulled up to their gate, and a middle-aged man and woman stepped out. They looked respectable, but their faces were unfamiliar and distant. "Good day," the man greeted as he approached. "My name is Andrew, and this is my wife, Catherine. We're Charlotte's relatives. We heard about the children and wanted to see them." Mary and John nodded silently, inviting them inside. Catherine approached the crib, gazing at the sleeping children. Tears filled her eyes. "They look so much like Charlotte," she whispered. "And what are your intentions?" John asked bluntly, his gaze unwavering. "We'd like to take them in. We have a home and can provide everything they need, Andrew replied. Everything except the love they've already found here, Mary said quietly, her eyes fixed on the children. The room was enveloped in silence. Andrew and Ekaterina exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. Think carefully. These children are no longer alone. If necessary, we'll fight for them, John said firmly. The visitors' faces showed a mix of surprise and admiration. We won't take them away, Andrew finally said. We see how much you care for them. Perhaps we should explore other ways to assist you. Relief and gratitude filled Mary and John's expressions. Those words felt like the first confirmation that their decision to keep the children was the right one. After Andrew and Ekaterina left, the house settled into a quiet stillness, broken only by the soft breathing of the sleeping little ones. John sat wearily, his hands resting on his knees, while Mary joined him, careful not to disturb the fragile peace. What do you think, John? She asked softly. I think they're good people, but I saw their eyes. They want to help, but it's not out of love for the children. Perhaps it's from a sense of obligation or guilt, he replied, staring thoughtfully at the fire. You're right, Mary nodded. But now I feel calm. These children will stay with us, I'm certain of it. Over the following days, life on the homestead gradually returned to its usual rhythm. John and Mary worked tirelessly, though their days were now filled with new joys and responsibilities. Sophia, Matthew, and Emma began showing their personalities. Sophia was quiet and observant, Matthew curious and brave, and Emma a mischievous little troublemaker who could find adventure anywhere. One early morning, as John went to feed the animals, he returned to the sound of cheerful laughter. Mary sat on the floor, surrounded by the three children reaching for wooden toys John had crafted from old scraps of wood. Look at them, John, Mary said with a smile, her eyes sparkling as she looked at her husband. Who would have thought our home was once so quiet? John knelt beside them, lifting Matthew into his arms. Our hands may not have known this kind of work before, but our hearts did, he said, tossing the boy into the air and smiling at his delighted giggles. Time passed quickly. Spring brought warmth and new tasks. John and Mary tended the garden while the children played nearby under Vera's watchful eye, who seemed to consider herself their second guardian. One afternoon, a cart approached the homestead. John immediately recognized Father James as he stepped down, carrying a sack. Good day, Father James greeted as he reached the porch. I brought something from the parishioners. People are starting to see your actions in a new light. They want to help. He handed John a sack of flour and several bundles of warm clothing for the children. Thank you, Father, John said quietly as he accepted the gift. We never expected anyone to support us. Not everyone understands good deeds right away, John, Father James said warmly. But your example has shown that love can accomplish so much. People are learning from you. Mary smiled, holding Emma, who stared curiously at their guest. We don't seek rewards or recognition, Mary added. These children are our joy and purpose. And that is what matters most, Father James replied, blessing them. With each passing day, John and Mary felt more certain that fate had brought Sophia, Matthew, and Emma to them for a reason. Their once quiet home was now alive with laughter and activity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John and Mary sat on the porch, watching the children play in the grass. Look at them, Mary. It feels like they've always been here, as if they're a part of us, John said, his voice warm. And they are, John. We've welcomed them into our hearts, and they've become ours, Mary replied, squeezing his hand. As the sun's last rays disappeared behind the hills, John and Mary realized their home would never be empty again. The three little miracles had filled their lives with meaning they thought was lost forever. Summer arrived, painting the land in vibrant greens and golds. Life on John and Mary's homestead was busy as ever. With the children now crawling and attempting their first steps, the days flew by. John built a small pen near the house so Sophia, Matthew, and Emma could safely play outside, while Mary watched in delight as they discovered something new each day. John, look at Emma, Mary called from the window, pointing outside. Emma, covered in dirt, sat by the garden with a grin, holding up a freshly pulled carrot. What a little rascal, John chuckled as he stepped onto the porch. Hey, young lady, save some for the rest of us. Emma's laughter rang out, and Vera, as always, followed closely behind, as if worried the girl might get into even more trouble. Meanwhile, the townsfolk's view of John and Mary had completely transformed. Once the subject of gossip, many now came to the homestead to offer help. Some brought milk, others fresh bread or hand-me-down clothes for the children. This is for the little ones, Mary, said their elderly neighbor Martha, handing over a basket of eggs. "You've done so much for these kids. It'd be wrong not to help." Mary accepted the gifts with gratitude, though she still wasn't used to the attention. "Thank you so much, Martha. May God bless you." "God already has, Mary," Martha replied warmly. "He brought a miracle into your home, and we can all see it." The elderly woman smiled as she turned to leave. Day by day, the little ones grew more attached to John and Mary, and the couple in turn couldn't imagine life without them. John, once stern and reserved, now spent hours sitting on the porch with Matthew on his lap, sharing stories about working the land. "You'll see, Matthew, when you grow up, you'll be strong and hardworking. This field will provide for you, just as it has for your grandmother and me," he said, gesturing toward the vast stretch of farmland. Meanwhile, Mary sang lullabies to Sophia or taught her simple words. She marveled at how the little girls, once helpless infants, were now babbling their first words and mimicking each other's actions. "Look, John," Sophia said. "Mama," Mary exclaimed one day, her face alight with joy. John looked up from his work and smiled. "And you were worried they'd forget us. We're everything to them now." One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John and Mary sat beneath the old oak tree, watching the children play in the grass. "Do you think Charlotte can see them?" Mary asked softly, her gaze fixed on the children. "I think she does," John replied. "And she's proud. She entrusted them to us, and we've done our best. We've given them a home and a family. What if we hadn't found them, John? What would have happened to them?" Mary whispered, clutching his hand. "I don't know, Mary, and I don't want to imagine it. Fate brought them to us for a reason. They gave us something we'd been missing for so long, the purpose to keep going," he said, his eyes reflecting the golden hues of the sky. Mary leaned her head on his shoulder and smiled. "You know, John, despite everything, I'm happy. We may not be young or wealthy, but we have them. And that's enough." "Yes, Mary. They are our family. And family is the most important thing in life," John said quietly, watching the three children run toward them, their laughter filling the air. Years passed quickly. Sophia, Matthew, and Amelia were no longer helpless toddlers. They grew, filling John and Mary's home with joy and meaning. John, though older, continued to work the land, while Mary cared for the house and the children, who had started helping with chores. "Sophia, Amelia, fetch some water from the well," Mary called one morning as the sun began to rise. "We've got it, Grandma." Sophia's cheerful voice rang out as she hurried in with a bucket, followed closely by Amelia, trying to keep up. Matthew, as always, stuck close to John, helping with small tasks like feeding the animals or carrying tools. "Grandpa, can I try fixing the fence myself?" Matthew asked one day, his face serious. "You're not quite ready for the fence, boy," John chuckled, patting his grandson's shoulder. "But if you want to help, here's a hammer. You can start learning." "I'm strong, just like you, Grandpa," Matthew declared proudly. John laughed, his eyes shining with pride. The children brought life into their home, and their love reminded John and Mary that every sacrifice they had made was worth it. One evening, as the sun dipped low, a woman appeared at their doorstep. It was Ekaterina, a distant relative of Charlotte who had visited years ago. "Madame, good evening," she said softly. "Come in," John invited, noticing a new sense of calm and respect in her demeanor. "I wanted to see the children and thank you. Back then, I didn't understand the weight of what you'd taken on. But now, looking at them, I see they couldn't have found a better home than yours," Ekaterina said, watching Sophia, Matthew, and Amelia play in the grass. Mary smiled as she looked at the children. "They're ours. Not by blood, but by love. Charlotte entrusted them to us, and we'll love them forever." "I believe you." Ekaterina nodded. "And if you ever need help, know you have my support." Her words touched John and Mary deeply. After Ekaterina left, Mary turned to John. "You see, John, they finally understand," she said softly. "Yes, Mary. But the most important thing is, we always knew it deep down," he said, gazing at the horizon where the sun was setting behind the hills. Many years had passed. Sophia, Matthew, and Emma had grown up, each carving out their own unique path in life. Sophia had become a school teacher in their village, Matthew inherited John's deep love for the land and continued working on the farm, while Emma, ever adventurous, moved to the city to help the poor and those in need. One warm summer afternoon, the three now grown children returned to the farm to visit their aging adoptive parents. John and Mary were sitting on the porch, their hair now completely white, their faces lined with deep wrinkles. Yet, the kindness in their eyes remained unchanged. "Grandma, Grandpa!" Emma's voice rang out as she ran ahead of the others, wrapping them in a tight hug. Sophia and Matthew followed behind, carrying a basket filled with treats and gifts. "We missed you so much," Sophia said, kissing Mary on the cheek. "We've been waiting for you every single day," Mary replied, wiping away a tear. Later, as they gathered around a table under the shade of a large tree, the family laughed, sharing stories from the past. John watched them and then spoke quietly. "You were the greatest blessing fate ever gave us. We couldn't offer you wealth, but we gave you a home and love. That's more valuable than anything in the world, Grandpa," Sophia replied, squeezing his hand. That night, as the stars lit up the sky above their home, Mary and John sat together on the porch in peaceful silence, gazing at the heavens. "Do you think Charlotte is proud of us?" Mary asked softly. "Of course she is," John answered. "We gave these children what she wanted for them most, a family and love. And under that starry sky, their home remained the place where the story of 3 little miracles had forever changed the lives of 2 humble souls." Thank you for listening to this story to the end. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, share this story with your friends and family, and let us know your thoughts. Your support inspires us to continue creating new stories every day. Stay tuned for our next amazing tale, coming to your screen soon. In the description below, you'll find a catalog of all our stories. See you next time.